Greetings, pilgrims. My name is Doug. This is Camino 2020. And for several months now, I've been chronicling my preparations for getting ready to walk the Camino de Santiago in Spain next year in 2020. But I realized that I hadn't really spent a lot of time yet talking about what the Camino actually is. So, today's the day. So there is a lot that can be said about the Camino, and a lot of background information to fill in that will kind of help you understand more about what it is than I probably have time to go into in one video. And to keep this from being super long, I'm going to kind of skim the surface on this talk and then go deeper in some other videos down the road. So to begin with, the Camino is a pilgrimage route. So what's a pilgrimage? Well, in religious terms, a pilgrimage is a journey undertaken for spiritual reasons to a place of spiritual significance. So, for example, in Christianity, an obvious pilgrimage destination would be the Holy Land in Israel, where pilgrims can see the things that Jesus saw and go the places he went. And unsurprisingly, historically speaking, the Holy Land has been the #1 pilgrimage destination for Christians, followed closely by Rome. Even though the church started in Israel, it very quickly moved west. And in the 200 years or so from the deaths of the early apostles until Constantine, the emperor, legalized Christianity, Rome was the major persecutor of the church. The Roman Empire, especially in its capital, produced a lot of martyrs, and the sites of the deaths and churches dedicated to these saints become big pilgrimage destinations themselves, and there are a lot of them in Rome. Now, what might come as a surprise is that the third most popular pilgrimage route for Christians throughout history has been the Way of St. James, or the Camino de Santiago. Now, this has a somewhat curious history. First of all, St. James the Greater, that's his icon there, and this is the saint that we're talking about when we talk about Santiago, Spain, and he doesn't really get a lot of screen time in the New Testament. Most of what he is famous for happened after the New Testament had been written and is now a big part of the legacy of Christianity in Spain, but much of it is fairly unknown outside of that country. And by the way, he's called the Greater because he was older than the younger, lesser St. James, who, if you're familiar with the New Testament or Christian history, you are a lot more familiar with. The story goes that St. James is really the one that brought the gospel into Spain. He was later martyred, and his relics, his bones, found their way back to Spain, some say miraculously, and they were later discovered by a hermit who found them through a vision in a place that he called the Field of Stars, the Campos de la Stella, Compostela, Spain. And so when the king of the area, back then known as Asturias, King Alfonso II, in the real early 9th century, 820s, 830s, heard about the discovery of these relics, he made a pilgrimage from the capital, Oviedo, all the way down to the Compostela to confer with the bishop and discover what there was to know about these relics. And that pilgrimage route is really what got the pilgrimage started. They established a monastery at Compostela. It later became the place for the cathedral, the seat of the bishop, and the final resting place of the relics of St. James the Greater. Now, why is the Camino such a popular pilgrimage now? There are a number of different reasons, and I'm even speculating on a few of them. But one of the main ones is that the idea of the pilgrimage is that you undertake a fairly arduous journey in order to reach these areas. For the early and medieval and even modern Christian pilgrims, a pilgrimage is not just a long walk to see some cool relics. It is imbued with spiritual significance and can even have salvific effects. And so the idea for many of the early pilgrims was really a bit of suffering and danger even at that time in Spain. So to complete a pilgrimage was a pretty big spiritual deal. It wasn't something you just did because you had a few weeks of vacation time coming. And over time, the routes that pilgrims would take to these areas began to be built up. An infrastructure emerged where there were becoming places to stay, places to find food. Now, most of that infrastructure is gone when it comes to the Holy Land, when it comes to Rome. These have really become more vacation destinations. And that's not to say you can't make a pilgrimage to those places, but you're not really able to do the old school pilgrimage where you just start from point A, take everything you've got that you need on your journey on your back, and walk until you're there. The Camino, however, has survived. Although the pilgrimage route has waxed and waned in popularity over the years, especially due to things like the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment period, and this sort of thing, the infrastructure has largely remained intact. And in the 1980s, it got a big resurgence when a priest named Father Elias Valinia started really campaigning to get the Camino back on the map and operational again. Since that time, the Camino has become more and more popular. It's said that 300,000 pilgrims walk the way annually now. And so now, walking the Camino has become a fairly popular thing to do, even among people that aren't necessarily doing it for Christian or specifically spiritual reasons. Alright, so now let's talk about the routes themselves. You'll notice that I use the plural there. But although many people identify the way with a single route, which I will get to in a second, the Camino is really not about a specific route. It depends on where you start. Now, completion of a pilgrimage to Compostela, right there, does get you a certificate of completion. And in order to get that, you have to basically be able to prove that you walked a distance of at least 100 kilometers on your pilgrimage. Now, of course, Spain is a big country. It's going to be a lot more than 100 kilometers from pretty much anywhere you start. However, the different routes depend on where you start from. So, for example, the English way right here is for people who have begun their pilgrimage in England. This is really about the only route on this map that isn't long enough by itself to get the certificate. Now, the route that most people think of when they think of the Camino is the route that begins back here in France, the Camino Francais. It begins in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, quickly crosses over into Spain, goes over the Pyrenees Mountains, into Pamplona, and then basically goes across nearly the entire country until you get to Compostela. This is the route that is featured in the movie The Way, and when people talk about walking the Camino, that's usually what they are referring to. The original route, or what is known as the Primitivo, begins here in Oviedo, and it follows this route through mountains practically the entire way, meets up with the Camino Francais here in Melilla, and then finishes at Compostela. But as you can see from this map, there are numerous ways to complete the Camino depending on where you begin. Alright, so there you have it. That's the Camino de Santiago. I will be doing future videos that go into greater depth about the history, especially some of the stuff about St. James the Greater. Very interesting. I hope this video has helped you in your thinking about the Camino. If it has, hit that thumbs up like button down there if you would, and please subscribe to the channel, click that bell notification. Until next time, buen Camino.